We find ourselves amidst geostrategic changes. And today, these geostrategic changes matter from different point of view, from geopolitics, economics, trade, business, and mostly balance of power in the Southeast Med. Today, I have the distinct pleasure to have with us Dr. Kobi Michael, who's a senior fellow at the INSS, and he's also senior fellow at the University of Neapolis Pafos. My name is Dr. Marios Panagiotis Neapolis. I'm the CEO of Strategy International, and this is Prime Analysis. Professor Michael, welcome.
My pleasure.
A lot of changes are taking place lately. We've seen in Ramadan challenges facing Israel, challenges in the East Med, attacks, rocket attacks. What is taking place right now?
I think that in order to understand the current events, we have to go back something like 12 years to the eruption of the Arab upheaval, which is known by some naive people in Europe as the Arab Spring. I think that in the best case scenario, it's a very cold and dark winter. Till 12 years ago, geopolitical order, the regional order, was based in principle on the fundamental brick of the Arab territorial nation state. What has happened since the outbreak of the Arab upheaval is that the regional order actually has been changed. And the fundamental brick that we historically for a century we used to know is not there anymore as a fundamental brick. And if we want to understand the regional order, we have to understand the competition for hegemony and influence between four camps or four axes. The first one is led by Iran, that actually controls four Arab countries or four Arab capitals, Beirut in Lebanon, Damascus in Syria, Baghdad in Iraq, and Sana'a in Yemen. And they like to work and to use proxies because they don't like the idea of spilling Iranian blood. And they are present also in the Palestinian arena, and they have two proxies which are different, but both of them are Iranian proxies, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas. Later on, maybe we will elaborate on that. The second axis is the Jihadiyya Salafiyya, which is, I would say, the most radical, violent, extreme Islamic branch, which was represented by ISIS, that does not exist anymore from the territorial point of view, but it exists as an idea, and they have operational capacities as well all over the Middle East and even beyond the Middle East. The third axis is the political Islam, the Muslim Brotherhood. This axis or this camp is mainly supported by Turkey, where the AKP of Erdogan is the Turkish version of the Muslim Brotherhood, and by Qatar. Hamas, by the way, in the Palestinian arena, is the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. And the fourth camp is the Arab Sunni pragmatic camp, which is led by Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and includes all the Arab monarchies, the Palestinian Authority, and Israel as well, at least much more officially since the Abraham Accord were signed in the summer of 2020. Now, in each conflict arena in the Middle East, we can find all the four axes, which have eventually a sort of a zero-sum game between of them. And we don't have to be confused for some because of some bizarre cooperation between players from different camps, like, for an example, the agreement that was moderated by China between Iran and Saudi Arabia. They are adversaries, and they will remain adversaries historically, strategically, and we don't have to be confused in this regard. And in order to understand the current order of the Middle East, we have to understand the nature of the competition between those axes, which is found, as I said, in each conflict arena in the Middle East.
I need to go a bit deeper, because you've given us both the strategic and operational values and camps, if I can call it like this. So let me just back up for a minute and just talk about the way that Israel perceives threat. You have explained all possible actors and sides, but what about the threat? How is the threat perceived for Israel? I mean, we saw the recent attacks into Israel during Israeli Passover, and we also saw that this takes place also in the middle of Ramadan. It's very serious. How is it translated to a threat perspective in Israel, and how can it be considered as a threat perspective to the periphery and maybe to the rest of the world?
I think that there is no doubt in Israel about the hand that shakes the cradle. And there is no doubt that the hand is in Iranian hand. Now, it is true that we have some additional threats like the Palestinian threat, okay, mainly Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and actually Israel faces a terror campaign since March 22 that was launched and began by the Palestinian Islamic Jihad in the northern districts of the West Bank. And as I mentioned before, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad is a pure Iranian proxy. I mean, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad cannot exist without the Iranian assistance. Right. And the Iranians had and still have an interest to undermine stability here in the region. They want actually to drag Israel to a sort of attrition war, a terror campaign that will be well orchestrated and well organized, where the Palestinian Islamic Jihad was the pioneer, okay, or the pivot at the first beginning. And we have to ask ourselves how it comes that the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which is it's not such a big terror organization, a very radical, extreme environment one, how it comes that it became to be the strongest Palestinian terror organization in the northern parts of the West Bank, and the answer to that is Iran. Iran that uses its Hezbollah proxy. They control Syria, that became to be a narco state, okay? It's a failed state where the borders between Syria and Lebanon actually do not exist, as well as the borders between Syria and Jordan. They are totally open and are not controlled. And the Iranians are using it in order to smuggle not only drugs to Jordan, but also weapon and money, and through Jordan and the Jordan Valley, okay, directly to Jenin. It's a very short distance, and generally speaking, it's very easy to do that. Israel does all the efforts in order to prevent that, but we don't have 100% of success. And if they have some difficulties in transferring real money, okay, they use Bitcoin or something like that. And eventually, due to the vacuum that was created by the Palestinian Authority in the last 2 years or so in the northern districts of the West Bank, and due to the Iranian motivation, which is assisted by Hezbollah from South Lebanon through Syria, Jordan, and Jenin, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad became to be the strongest Palestinian terror organization there. And Hamas is also an Iranian proxy, but in a different manner. Hamas is much bigger organization, and it is much more independent. It can live without the Iranian support as well. They are assisted by the Iranians, but we have to understand that if the Palestinian Islamic Jihad has no political aspirations, okay, they don't intend to replace the Palestinian Authority or to control the Palestinian people. They have only one thing in mind, okay, their raison d'etre is the armed resistance against Israel, and nothing else. Hamas, on the other hand, has some political aspirations as well. Hamas is not only a terror organization, it is also a religious movement, a social movement, and mainly a political movement that challenges the Palestinian Authority / Fatah. Okay, the end state of Hamas is the gain the full control over the entire Palestinian system, which means the PLO and the Palestinian Authority. Okay, they don't see themselves as partners of Fatah,
Yes.
but as a replacement for Fatah. And this is something that goes together with the Iranian interest as well. And this is the reason that the Iranians support Hamas. Okay. Now, going back to the question about the threat, so the Palestinian arena, generally speaking, is a threat. And not only because of the terror, but because of the Palestinian Authority, which is weakening and unfortunately almost does not function, not in an effective manner, okay? And this is a threat as well, because if the Palestinian Authority is not there, and the Israeli interest is to have a functioning and strong and viable Palestinian Authority, then there is a higher probability to have a chaotic situation in the West Bank, and to see a much I would say serious fragmentation among the Palestinians. And at the end of the day, it means that Israel will have to get to have the responsibility of running the daily life of the Palestinian population, and this is something that Israel really doesn't want. So if we have, if we will go along the borders, okay, and on the north we have Hezbollah, and in northeast we have Syria, and in the south, Sinai Peninsula, we have ISIS, and the Gaza Strip we have Hamas, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and in the West Bank we have them as well.
Yes, Iran.
We see that eventually this is a sort of a structure, okay? This is a sort of an architecture, a regional architecture, where there is a very central pillar or very central generator, which is Iran, okay? And we don't have to be confused in this regard, and we have to understand what are the Iranian interests, and we have to understand that the Iranian efforts, which are done in all the fronts around Israel, are done in order to be able to operate simultaneously at least 5 fronts against Israel in the D-Day, okay? This is the deterrence equation of the Iranians, and they want eventually to deter Israel from attacking Iranian assets on Iranian soil, okay? This is their greatest fear,
Right.
because of their nuclear infrastructures.
There are some things that, as you were talking, they were coming into my mind, and they're very interesting but important also. I envision the latest geostrategic changes, Iran coming closer to Saudi Arabia, having a dialogue, China investing into Iran, Iran having the support of Turkey and Russia, so therefore implementing a more in-depth policy vis-a-vis Israel, because I presume that Iran sees Israel also as a similar threat. The recent attacks, they seem to me like a starting point for Iran. The way that you have explained it to me so far, I understand that these things have surrounded, and unfortunately they are made real on the threat perspective of how Israel sees its neighbors at this point. But the timing matters. And it happened at a time which is religious for both Jewish and Muslims. And the same time, same week for the Catholics, the week forward for the Orthodox. And it seems like it's a starting point. So somehow it makes sense that if the accusation is actually found out that Iran is building on this, it seems that Iran has now further support. So if Israel considers that Iran creates this, who finances Iran? Who finances all this research? Who gives the support of the knowledge, technology knowledge? Who gives the support of the manpower? I'm pretty sure you mentioned there's no borders. There's also huge poverty. People are trying to find serious exits. It seems that Hamas is, as you said, a political value added with regard to the society, so it somehow attempts to put its finger left and right in the everyday life. The Palestinian Authority, we're yet to see some developments with regards to a possibility of further negotiations with Israel. So where do we stand? Who supports Iran?
We have to remember that historically, Iran was a regional power. And Iran, till today, perceives itself as a regional power. Not only a regional power, but the regional power that will be able to leverage its strength in the regional scale to the international system as well. And this is the reason that they are fighting for hegemony and influence in the entire Middle East. Yes. Okay. Now, the Iranian people is a very talented people, and they have resources, although they are under sanctions, and although they are, I would say, in a poor condition economically, they still have a lot of resources, but they know how to use resources in the places that they work and operate. Just for an example, as I mentioned before, okay, they turned Syria, together with Assad the son, Assad the Syrian president, to a narco-state. And I don't know...
Assad is supported by the Russians as well.
Yes, but the more essential support is the Iranian support. Okay, the Russians do not control Syria. The Russians are there. By the way, they minimized their presence there in Iran because the problems that they have in Ukraine. But they are not controlling Iran and the regime as the Iranians. And we have to understand that the Iranians are going through a Shiitization process of Syria. You know, they convince people to convert to the Shia. They operate not only militarily in Syria, but also religiously and societally and economically. And they turned Syria, as I said before, to a narco-state. Syria today is the biggest factory in the world for some artificial drugs which are smuggled to Jordan, that became to be a regional hub, and from Jordan to the entire Middle East and to Europe. And some of these very dangerous artificial drugs might be found also in the streets of Cyprus. Okay, the drug industry became to be the main economic branch that actually feeds the Syrian regime and the Iranians as well. This is something that provides them economic capabilities. Now, in order to relate to your question, we have to go back a bit and to understand the position of the Americans here in the region and the role of the USA here in the region, at least as it is perceived in the eyes of the local or the regional players. This is, by the way, one of the reasons that brought Saudi Arabia to come closer to Iran, okay?
And that's an interesting point of view to see.
Yeah, because the Americans have decided that they are going to withdraw from the Middle East. At least this is the perception of the local players. This is for sure the perception of the Saudis. Okay. Now, they feel that the traditional, the historical American umbrella that was given for decades, okay, to them and to the other monarchies in the Gulf and to the other American allies here in the broader Middle East, this umbrella became to be narrower there in comparison to what it used to be before. And they have to hedge the risks, and this is the reason that they are trying to calm the tension between them and the Iranians. And as I said before, we don't have to be confused in this regard. They are not going to be a very close friends. Mm-hmm. Okay, they have some historical roots of
and
adversary.
Roots.
Of course, religious roots and historical roots, because Iran perceives itself as the leader of the Shiite world, yep. And the Saudis perceive themselves as the leaders of the Sunni world. Okay, mm-hmm. And we know the historical religious rift between the Shia and the Sunni. And we know that the interests of the Saudis are not necessarily the interests of the Iranians and vice versa. And I think that once the United States created a sort of a vacuum here, and under the existential assumption that there is no vacuum in the world, somebody else went in, and these were the Chinese firstly, and then the Russians, and they are trying to build their and to promote their interests. And I think that they are succeeding in a way to do that.
So it's becoming more complicated.
Yes, and I think that the Saudis still prefer the American umbrella, okay? And they want the Americans to be here in a more significant manner. And they are challenging the Americans by getting closer to the Chinese, by getting closer to the Iranians. I think that this is the Saudi way to indicate to the Americans, okay, you have to be back here in the region. But Iran was and still is a regional power with a lot of capacities, and I think that the global developments, mainly the war in Ukraine and the cooperation between Iran and Russia, actually revive the Iranian perception in this regard. And now we see that Iran is deeply involved not only in the broader Middle East, but also in East Europe and mainly Eurasia. Okay, the Iranians have many interests in Eurasia, and we see that although some of their interests are conflicting the Russian interests in Eurasia, it doesn't prevent the Iranians and the Russians to cooperate in Ukraine. Okay, so
in fact, there are a lot of publications that say that Russia is now using Iranian drones and Iranian technology, including also weaponry, to fight the war in Ukraine. So it's no coincidence that these things happen at the same time.
And we can see that the players can conduct their strategies with internal tensions and conflicts. Right. Okay, on the one hand, Iran and Russia historically are adversaries with regard to Eurasia, but in the very same time, okay, they can cooperate in Ukraine.
Right.
So
I mean, it's a bit of irony because in Syria you see countering U.S. and Russian forces, and you see also Iran trying to be involved into Syria, but Russia abstaining or bringing an obstacle to Iran every now and then when the
we see that
Russian interests are not there implemented.
Russia tries to moderate between Iran and Turkey with regard to northern Syria.
There's also Turkey there.
And we can see that in some occasions, okay, Iran and Turkey, which belong to two different axes, okay, Turkey to the political Islam and Iran to the Shiite axis, and Turkey, by the way, perceives itself as well as a regional power, okay, and historically they were an empire, okay, a regional power, not less than Iran, but and they have some conflicting interests in Syria, but they have something in common, a common threat in northern Syria, and this is the Kurds. Okay, right. Because the Kurds are a very significant minority in Iran and in Turkey as well, and both regimes, but Iran and Turkey, okay, both regimes are really fear from the Kurds and the possibility that they will ask or demand for more autonomy, and therefore the Kurdish autonomy in Iraq is a threat in the Iranian and in the Turkish eyes, right. And the Kurdish autonomy in northern Syria, okay, is also a threat, and therefore we can find those two adversaries, Iran and Turkey, cooperate in northern Syria with regard to the Kurds.
Let's not forget that the Kurds were very, very close into creating their own state at some point, very recently, and it was the United States who initially backed it up and then backed off this whole situation of what to do. Probably the beginning problem would start in northern Iraq, but there were a lot of threats from Turkey coming in that if they would start their own state, they would be involved militarily, which would make things more complicated. But you can also denounce the fact that you have a majority of Kurds over there. The question is, these things have become so complicated that it seems that there is a spillover. The way that you're explaining things is that there is a constant spillover. So on the one hand, you have reasoning, you have methodologies, you have, because these methodologies can be high level or low level, can be a terrorist level. You have implications against Western interests, may I say, Israeli interests, may I say, American interests, may I say. But there is consistency. I mean, while you were talking, also, I was thinking that while we talk about Iran, there was a collaboration between the Greek Secret Service and the Israeli Secret Service of Mossad in avoiding a terrorist act, which would have been directly against the interests of both Greece and Israel. And these people were of
And a year ago it
Pakistani
was in
nationality.
Cyprus.
Exactly. There was also another case in Cyprus. And they were of Pakistani nationality, which was led by Iran, which traced back the information coming from Iran. It may not be from the official Iranian government, but definitely from proxy teams that operate from Iran to the world, which makes things a bit more complicated, even more so in the operational scale. I think the United States, in fact, does a geostrategic change with regards to where it pivots. It wants to have more structured approach. I do not think that it was totally expected to see that approach between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And in fact, I think you're right. They will not be at the level that is kind of expected or said in the media would be. It's a surprising move, obviously, but it is not something that it was totally not expected at certain points. It makes even things more complicated with the Yemen war. I mean, it's a direct Saudi coalition versus Iranian proxies fighting in Yemen. Sana'a being the capital of Pan-Arabism and now being totally destroyed. But things are becoming a bit more complicated with regards to what is it expected from the Europeans and the Americans to do in the Southeast Med, in the Middle East. And the reason why I say this is because the recent attacks, including also attacks from South Lebanon. And Lebanon has, as you know, a very big financial problem, however, has been into direct talks for the exclusive economic zone with Israel, has been with talks with Cyprus, has been with talks with Turkey, and we saw an approximation of, or a possibility even of establishing some sort of trade routes. Egypt is keeping a very low profile in this regard because things as they develop, Egypt wants peace and stability. Jordan definitely wants peace and stability, but at the same time, as you understand, Jordan has a very big population of Palestinian descendancy, which are getting frustrated every time that this is taking place, such actions are taking place. So where are the Europeans, where are the Americans standing as of now? What you have decided, what you have explained to us is exactly as it is to date. How are the Americans going to react? How are the Europeans going to react? We see very small reactions. The first reaction came from President Macron while he was in his trip in China. Where do they stand? What do you think will happen ultimately?
Unfortunately, the European continent, and generally speaking the EU, is not a significant player or a very influential player in the broader Middle East. Things might be changed because of the war in Ukraine, because now things have been changed in the perception of the leading European countries, be it Germany, France, and even the Scandinavian countries like Finland, and Sweden that are trying to be affiliated. Finland is formally, officially affiliated already with NATO, and they understand, because of the war in Ukraine, the importance of military strength, something that was neglected in the European continent since World War II, mainly in Germany. But not only, okay, the idea that the IDF is much bigger than the British military, it's something which is almost a sort of a paradox, okay?
But wars were not meant to be after World War II. I mean, the idea of a European community, the association,
yes, but
which led to the European Union, had to do with more peaceful environment.
But wars were after World War II, okay, we have to remember what has happened in former Yugoslavia, and eventually NATO in Bosnia and Herzegovina and in Serbia / Kosovo actually intervened. And when we say NATO, those days it was not the European component of NATO that was the more active one. It was the American component. The same thing, by the way, in Libya, okay, after the eruption of the Arab upheaval. But Europe, I think, understands pretty well and better than before that the threats, okay, are not only domestic threats in the European continent, but the threats are beyond the European continents and mainly from the close neighbors in the Middle East, because most of the countries in the Middle East, mainly the Arab countries in the Middle East, mainly the Arab republics in the Middle East, are failed countries. Now, the phenomenon of failed country or failed state is not a new phenomenon, but the Arab upheaval strengthened dramatically, okay, the level and of the state failure of all the Arab countries. It goes back to the beginning of our discussion with regard to the role of what used to be the fundamental brick, okay, of the territorial national Arab state, which does not exist anymore because most of the republics do not exist anymore. Some of them do not exist at all, like Yemen, Libya, okay, if you want, even Lebanon, and the others like Syria, Iraq, okay, and even Egypt became to be a failed state in a very severe degree. There are differences between the level of state failure, but all of them are failed states.
Yeah, so volatility is evident in everyday life.
Yes, and now the failed state as a phenomenon is not something which is restricted to the local boundaries of the failed states. Okay, failed states are making a very good job in exporting problems, okay, to the region and beyond the region. And it begins with refugees, and it goes with terrorism and crime and economy problem and so on and so forth. And we saw what happened to the European continent because of Syria and Afghanistan, just for an example, as failed states, with the flow of refugees that came to Europe and actually affected dramatically all the European politics. What we see, what we are witnessing in the last decade or so, is the flourishing of popular parties, okay, in almost all the European countries. See what has happened just on last Sunday in Finland, okay, in the election in Finland, okay, who won the election? And we see what is happening with alternative to Deutschland in Germany, what is happening in France, what has happened in Hungary, in Italy, in Poland, okay, and
don't you think it's a bit natural? I mean, the Ukraine war probably woken up NATO, because its raison d'être has now been answered for the next 50 years.
Yes.
But also the European Union in the rapprochement with regards to its neighborhood policies. I mean, it's only normal that you would change your neighborhood policies also in the Middle East for Ukraine. So I see it somehow as an opportunity for the Europeans to be involved in the Middle East.
Of course, I totally agree with you. And I think that this is the moment for the European continent, for the EU, to become relevant again, okay?
Such as Euro-Atlantic, both EU and NATO.
Yes, of course. But I'm talking specifically about the European politics,
right.
about the EU.
Yes.
What should be the role of the EU in the current Middle East? And I think that at least the European leaders, and there is a gap between the understanding of the European leaders and the general mood of the populaces in the European countries, okay? I think that the most of the European leaders understand pretty well that Israel is the western fort, okay, in the Middle East, actually the last barrier. And I think that they understand pretty well that many dangers might evoke and come from the Middle East and will go through the gates of Europe to the entire continent. And therefore, I think that the Europeans have an interest to be much more involved and much more influential in this regard. And I think that their contribution or most helpful contribution should be in creating the new regional architecture. It means that in order to tackle Iran, which is the biggest threat, not only to Israel, by the way. People tend to think that Iran is the private business of Israel. No, Iran is the only country in the entire world that fights militarily Iran. Okay, this is, by the way, the reason.
I mean, they're involved in Yemen. I mean, they're far away from the geographical proximity. You see this now in
No,
European
but I'm talking
countries,
of
so-
fighting directly Iran. Okay,
Right.
This is Israel is the only.
I mean, the United States has also said directly that threat perspective.
The United States
I mean, may not be number one, but
rarely responds, okay, to Iranian attacks. But the United States of America doesn't fight Iran. Israel is the only country that fights Iran, and I think that the Arab countries, mainly Saudi Arabia, but the other Gulf countries as well, and not only them, understood pretty well that the only reliable ally or player that they can rely on is Israel, not the United States of America.
can I say something? Thus, the Abrahamic Accord.
Exactly. And this was the reason that the Saudis that were behind the scenes, okay, supported the Abrahamic Accords. Without the Saudis, without the Saudi support, there would not be Abraham Accords. And the Saudis actually normalized relations with Israel, not officially, not on the table, okay, beyond the table, but there are, I would say, or there is a very broad strategic cooperation between Israel and Saudi Arabia, because Iran is the biggest threat for Saudi Arabia as well, by the way, as well as the Jihadiyya Salafiyya and the political Islam. And all of these three threats, where the leading threat is Iran, are Israeli threats as well. I mean, or threats towards Israel, and this is the reason that we have common or joint strategic interests in this regard, and this is the reason that brought Saudi Arabia to normalize non-officially the relations with Israel and to support the official normalization with the Emirates and Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan, and. I think that if we understand, or if we accept the assumption that what we see in front of our eyes in the broader Middle East is a very well structured Iranian structure, okay, or composition, we have to tackle this structure with another structure, and the other structure should be much stronger.
So a new architecture for alliances.
Exactly,
Right.
and this should be even beyond the historical Middle East, which includes the Arab countries and Israel. This new structure or new architecture should also reach to Europe and should include European countries, where Cyprus, Greece, Italy, France, okay?
So we're talking about the trilateral becoming a more absolute alliance.
Exactly.
In fact, this is quite interesting. Because I know that you're doing this in your research, but I like the fact that you pointed it out as an architecture of security, and I think we should write more about this.
Not only security, it should be. I mean, it should provide a much better security, and mainly to provide a much better, I would say, a solution or reply, you name it, to the Iranian threat. Okay, but it should be based on some other interests as well, be it economic interests, infrastructures, energy, tourism, transportation.
Electricity that is building up now.
Yes, exactly. And I think that if we will be able to establish such an architecture, a regional architecture, a broad regional architecture, where the European countries will be a very significant component of this new architecture, then Europe will become much more relevant, much more influential, and I think that this will be the way that will enable the free world, okay, the Western world, to tackle the Iranian threat, because the Iranian threat is a very significant threat, the most significant threat on the free world. Generally speaking, okay? I mean, it's not only on Israel, it's on Cyprus, on Greece, on France, and on Germany.
And just leading to my final question for you. I mean, we could have hours and hours to discuss about those issues, and thank you very much for giving us both the global holistic approach and the security threats and the possibilities that are opening up. But I would like to end with some local, regional elements of alliances. You spoke about the alliances. I'm a proponent. I also write about the alliances and the need to have this regional alliance being shaped, because in fact we need to solve the problems in the Middle East. It's volatility cannot go forever, and we need to progress. But I want to know, how do you anticipate? How are the relations between Israel and Cyprus? Maybe in the extension to Greece as well. We are seeing the trilateral moving along. We see a lot of positive vibes from Egypt, from Jordan. We see back and forth travels of heads of state. We see France being involved, the US being involved, Turkey somehow acquiring to not become part of it, but they want to play the bigger game and shift. So ultimately, in a solution of the Cyprus issue, we may be able to discuss some sort of collaboration. But where do we see the main pillars these days being Israel, Cyprus?
I think that we should think in a gradual manner, which means that first of all, we have to devote the efforts in order to build or to shape or to create the eastern basin of the Mediterranean architecture, which includes Israel, Cyprus, Greece, maybe even Italy. I have some doubts with regard to Turkey, but I believe that such an architecture will moderate Turkey. I mean, will force Turkey to behave differently. First of all, we see that Erdogan has changed his policy towards Israel, and there is a sort of reconciliation between Israel and Turkey. But we didn't come back to the golden era of the relations between Israel and Turkey, and I doubt the possibility that we will be able to return to the golden era. But Turkey, as I said before, perceives itself as a regional power, and they want to be influential, and they are involved in many arenas in the Middle East, from Libya to Syria and beyond, even in the Red Sea. Okay. And it is a regional power that we have to take into consideration. But I think that if we will be able to create a regional architecture that will include Cyprus, Greece, maybe Italy, but the Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, the other Gulf countries, Qatar, I put aside because Qatar is a different problem that maybe we have to have a different discussion. Egypt, Jordan,
Bahrain.
Israel, Bahrain, of course, Israel, if you want even know Oman, Morocco,
France.
yes, and of course Israel and the Palestinian Authority. I think that we will be able to reach some major advantages. First of all, by creating such an architecture, we eventually are enlarging the pie, which means, for an example, the Israeli-Palestinian issue or conflict will not remain as a bilateral issue between the Israelis and the Palestinians. It will be a component of a much bigger architecture, where the bigger architecture or the larger architecture will enable to provide more incentives to both sides, and in the very same time it will enable both sides to make more concessions and to take more risks. Why? Because they are components, they are parts of a bigger architecture, okay? And if this architecture will be based on a very well-established economic, infrastructural, security relations, then it will ease on both sides to make the extra mile.
Right.
In the very same time, it might also affect Cyprus and the conflict in Cyprus. Because if such a regional architecture will be solid enough, okay, will be stable enough and will be strong enough, it will affect dramatically the strategic behavior of Turkey. Because Turkey will want, I'm sure about it, to be part of this architecture, and then
its businesses, trade,
of course,
direct relations.
and then Turkey maybe will be ready more than today to make some concessions with regard to Cyprus.
And the Cyprus issue.
Of course. And I think that this is something that will inject a new energy to the entire region. And in my eyes, this is the big hope. This is the strategic horizon that I see in front of my eyes. And I think that at least geographically, and not only geographically, Cyprus is a sort of a hub. And Cyprus can be, something that everybody can live with and feel comfortable with. And I think that symbolically and geographically, it is something like a center, at least of the eastern basin of the Mediterranean. And I think that we have to renew the Judo-Cypriot relations. I don't know if our audience is aware to, but till the 2nd century, okay,
of course,
there was a very big Jewish community that flourished here
as well.
Yes, under the Roman Empire, and I think that this is time to renew the strategic historical relations between Cyprus and Israel. And as you probably know, the Israel is like very much Cyprus. There are many Israelis, yes. So let's do it.
Professor Michael, thank you very much for being with us today. I really appreciate it, and I really hope we're going to have another discussion yet again. As you said, for other places in the world, I know that you're a busy man. I know that you're an expert. You're a practitioner, not only a professor. But thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you,
Professor. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for watching our web series Talk Prime Analysis. Please subscribe, like, and follow our social media and YouTube channel. My name is Dr. Mario F. Neapolis, and I'm the CEO of Strategy International. And remember, impact makes a difference.